The palace was a place of gleaming marble and velvet shadows, where whispers floated down stone corridors and the air always smelled faintly of rose oil and candle smoke. It was a world built on legacy and lineage, and within it moved figures who wore silk-like armor and spoke in clipped, polished tones. Amid these polished lives, unnoticed and always stooped low, was a girl with soot beneath her fingernails. Her name was Anaya, though no one ever said it kindly. They called her Ash Mouse, a word spat half in jest and half in disgust. She had grown used to it, the way the kitchen maids would wrinkle their noses when she passed, the way the courtiers pretended not to see her as she knelt to scrub another floor until her palms bled. The nobles did not see people like her. They saw movement, someone to polish boots, to refill goblets, to carry waste from one end of the world to another. She had no surname, no house. Only a vague tale whispered by the oldest of the washerwomen, that she'd been left on the palace steps wrapped in coarse brown cloth during a frost-bitten night 18 winters ago. No one claimed her. No one sought her. The steward had argued to send her to the orphanage across the river, but the Queen Mother had, for reasons never explained, ordered she be kept, fed, clothed, and put to work. And so, Anaya became a fixture of the palace, as silent as a shadow, as invisible as dust. The other servants tolerated her. Some were kind, offering crusts of bread when they thought no one watched. Others, bitter from their own chains, lashed out at her with words or hands. But no one knew her, not truly. Even Anaya, in moments of stillness, sometimes wondered if she had any real shape at all, or if she was simply the echo of someone else's decision long ago. There was, however, one thing that made her different. Across her shoulders, faintly glowing when she stepped into moonlight or strong candlelight, were markings. Not scars and not bruises, but marks, delicate, complex shapes that curled and twisted like a language she could not read. The first time she noticed them, she'd been scrubbing the mirrored floor of the east hallway and caught her reflection in the polished stone. At first she'd thought it was soot, a trick of the smoke that clung to everything she touched. But no matter how she scrubbed, the marks remained. They faded in sunlight, but deepened when the air grew cold. The older servants said nothing about them. Most avoided looking directly. The young ones whispered. She tried not to think about it. On most days, her life was too full of small tasks for her mind to wander. Filling the fire braziers in the west wing, fetching water from the well before dawn, folding laundry for guards who never once said thank you. But sometimes, when night fell and she was too tired to sleep, Anaya would sit in the space beneath the palace's oldest staircase, the one no one used anymore, and press her fingers to the markings. They didn't hurt. They never had. But they pulsed faintly like something alive. Like something waiting. If anyone had asked her what she wanted from life, Anaya wouldn't have known what to say. She had never been taught to want. Desire was a thing for nobles and dancers and merchants who had coins to lose. She had only known duty. But deep inside, buried beneath her layers of ash and fatigue, a small part of her burned, not with ambition but with hunger. A hunger to know. To belong. To be real. It was during one of her midnight assignments, cleaning the soot from the hearths in the high gallery, that she encountered the boy they all called Prince Kale. He was not alone. 2 other young nobles walked beside him, their laughter loud and careless. They carried goblets and wore their embroidered house colors like trophies. Anaya, kneeling by the fireplace, lowered her head as they passed. One of them stopped. "What's this rat doing here?" the taller boy sneered. Kale, who had a hunter's sharp eyes and the cruel smile of someone who'd never heard no, turned toward her. "Ash Mouse," he said, savoring the word. "Still crawling?" Anaya didn't speak. She never did, not when nobles addressed her. But Kale didn't move on. He stepped closer, his boots stopping inches from her fingers. "I heard something strange about you," he said. "Old Lady Marin swears you have stars burned into your back. Said she saw them once when you were bathing." The other boys laughed. Anaya stayed still. "Well?" Kale said, crouching. "Show me. Or shall I have the steward check for me?" She looked up then, not out of pride or defiance but something older. Deeper. Her eyes met his and for the first time Kale hesitated. A wind stirred through the high gallery, though all windows were sealed. The torches flickered. Anaya did not answer. She rose quietly and walked away. Her steps echoed like drums in the long empty hall. The next morning the Queen Mother summoned her. This had never happened before. Servants like Anaya did not stand in the presence of royalty. They were spoken about, not spoken to. But the Queen Mother, old, silver-haired, her spine straight as a sword, had waited in her private chamber, a scroll in her lap. "You were seen," she said, not looking at Anaya. Anaya said nothing. You have been warned to keep yourself small. Unseen. That is how you've survived, is it not? Still, Anaya stayed silent. The Queen Mother's eyes, pale and sharp, met hers. Do you understand what blood can cost, girl? Anaya wasn't sure what she meant. She nodded anyway. The Queen Mother nodded too, slowly, like making peace with something she couldn't change. There is a reason you were never sent away, she said. A reason I kept you close. Anaya's lips parted, but no sound came. The Queen Mother stood, walking to a cabinet. She retrieved something wrapped in red cloth. When she opened it, Anaya saw only a shard, broken, gold-edged, humming faintly with light. A piece of something much larger. This belonged to the first house, the Queen Mother said. Before the throne. Before this palace was even stone. Anaya's fingers trembled. The Queen Mother did not offer it to her. She simply looked. You have always been watched, Ashmouse. Even when no one spoke your name. Then she turned away, signaling the meeting was over. Anaya left the chamber in a daze. She did not know what the shard was. She did not know what it meant that it had glowed faintly when she entered. But something in her gut twisted, the same feeling she got just before a storm struck the hills. She returned to her duties, silent. She avoided Kale. She said nothing to the other servants. But that night, as she sat beneath the old staircase, she dared to trace the markings on her shoulders once more. They were glowing. Not faintly. Not dim. They burned like fire beneath her skin. And in the distance, in the deepest part of the palace, the part where no servants were allowed, something ancient stirred. Something that remembered her name before anyone had ever spoken it aloud. The royal library was older than the palace itself, or so the legends claimed. Built before the first stones of the current throne room were laid, it rose from the earth like a relic of some forgotten time. Most nobles rarely visited it, preferring the newer study halls filled with recent histories and decorative volumes. But Anaya had always felt pulled to it. There was a stillness in that place like breath held between heartbeats. The scent of ink, vellum, and old dust filled the air like incense. It was a place that remembered even when the world forgot. That morning she was sent there not by accident but by design. The steward had barked at her to clean the rot out of the west shelves, a job no one else wanted because it meant hours alone with brittle pages and ghost-thick air. Anaya didn't protest. She gathered her cloth, her bucket of lemon-scented oil, and made her way down the winding hallways into the quiet belly of the library. The main hall was cavernous, lined with spiraling staircases and thousands of books arranged by age, subject, and author. The west shelves, by contrast, were mostly abandoned. They contained maps drawn by dead kings, treaties long broken, philosophies that had fallen out of favor. There was an old superstition among the senior servants that those shelves whispered when no one watched. Anaya had never heard them, but she believed they might. She worked in silence, wiping down scroll boxes and brushing away cobwebs from carved crests that no longer meant anything. Her hands worked on habit, but her mind wandered. Since her strange encounter with the Queen Mother and the Golden Shard, she had felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. She noticed how torches flickered when she passed. How the marble beneath her bare feet sometimes vibrated with energy she couldn't explain. And her marks, the symbols across her shoulders, had not faded. As she climbed the old ladder to dust the topmost row, her fingers brushed against a ridge in the wall, not part of the wooden shelf but a seam in the stone behind it. Curious, she climbed down, pressed her palm to the cool surface and felt it shift. There was a click. A soft grinding noise. Then the back panel of the shelf eased forward an inch, revealing a narrow crack of darkness behind it. Anaya looked around. No one was there. Heart pounding, she pulled the shelf open further. Dust poured out in a lazy cloud, and the scent that met her was not decay but deep earth and fire, a smell like dry stone and lightning. Inside was a narrow passageway barely wide enough for her to walk through sideways. She hesitated only a moment before stepping in, dragging the shelf shut behind her. The tunnel descended quickly, the air cooling as she went. Her footsteps echoed, soft and rhythmic. After what felt like a dozen heartbeats, she emerged into a circular chamber lit by crystals embedded in the walls, glowing faintly gold. At the center was a pedestal holding a bundle of scrolls bound in silken cords. She didn't touch them at first. She simply walked around the room, her fingers brushing the walls. There were carvings etched into the stone, not just decorative flourishes but a language. Not one she'd ever been taught, but as her eyes moved across the symbols, something stirred inside her. She could read them. Not all at once, not perfectly, but the meanings bloomed in her mind like old memories. Here sleeps the truth of flame. When the sun was young, it wore no crown. She paused. Her breathing quickened. Returning to the pedestal, she undid the cords carefully. The scrolls were made from fine vellum, still intact despite their age. The ink had faded slightly, but the words pulsed as though they lived. She unfurled the top one and began to read. The sun line was first among thrones, a house not forged in war but in light. Before the stone walls rose. Before the river was named. They spoke with fire, and the fire knew them. The script didn't just speak history, it sang it. With each word she read, more of the language became clear to her, as if the knowledge had been buried in her bones and was now reawakening. The scroll spoke of queens who bore marks like hers. Of kings who ruled not with blades but with vision. Of a bloodline born of the sun's favor, chosen to protect balance between flame and earth. They were called the sun line, luminous, feared, revered. And then, abruptly, the scroll shifted tone. There came the turning. Fire was feared. Truth was silenced. The line of light was hunted, erased. Their names stricken. Their thrones torn down. But one ember was hidden. One flame left to sleep. Anaya's breath caught. The scroll glowed faintly in her hands. She dropped it in shock, but it floated gently to the ground like a leaf. Her heart thundered in her chest. The glow dimmed, but the words were now burned into her memory. She picked up the next scroll. It was shorter, more fragmented, filled with names and dates she didn't recognize. But one line stood out. Anaya, last marked. Born of ash but blooded in gold. She shall awaken the forgotten fire. She stared at her own name. There was no way. It couldn't be about her. But deep inside her chest, something cracked open, not like breaking but like hatching. A truth too large to name. The glow from the crystals intensified. The carvings on the wall shimmered with light. And for a brief moment she heard voices, not aloud but within her, chanting words in the old tongue. The same tongue written across her skin. She left the chamber dazed, the scroll still spread out, her fingers trembling. The passage sealed itself behind her with a whisper, as though it had only opened to remind her of something long forgotten. Back in the main library the air felt thicker. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, catching the edge of her soot-streaked cheek. She felt different. She was different. She cleaned for the rest of the day in silence, but her thoughts burned. Who had built that chamber? Who had hidden those scrolls? Why had no one else found them? And more pressing, who would kill to keep them hidden? That night, under a waxing moon, Anaya slipped from her sleeping mat and made her way back to the disused servant's wing. She knelt before a broken mirror and traced the markings on her shoulders. They shimmered in the moonlight, not silver but golden now. She whispered the names she remembered from the scrolls. Some felt familiar, like old songs half remembered. Then she spoke her own. Anaya, she said. The air around her warmed. Somewhere deep in the palace's stone bones she heard something shift. A groan. A sigh. Something was waking. She curled up beside the wall, pressing her ear to the floor. Beneath the marble a heartbeat pulsed. Not hers. Not human. But something that had waited long enough. Anaya waited until the palace slept. The corridors, once brimming with music and noise from the banquet, lay still and shadowed. She moved silently, her steps familiar with the rhythm of the palace's forgotten corners. The chamber they'd placed her in had no lock. That, in itself, was a message. They feared her enough not to restrain her, but not enough to send her away. Not yet. The scroll she'd once touched still burned in her memory, its words flickering like embers in her blood. But it wasn't the scroll she sought tonight, it was something deeper. She returned to the royal library through the servants' stairwell, bypassing the main doors. Inside, the scent of old parchment clung to the air like incense. Moonlight filtered through high windows, casting ghost-like rectangles across the floor. The noble's knowledge rested here, neat and organized, but it was the hidden knowledge Anaya wanted. She traced her fingers along the edge of the massive bookshelf she'd once dusted. Her hands, roughened by years of work, felt for the notch behind the third shelf, the same one that had given way the first time. With a gentle push, the panel shifted. The hidden corridor lay beyond, its walls tight, its air heavier. She followed it with a lantern she'd taken from the corridor, the same kind she'd carried all her years as a servant. But this time, it lit her way not as a tool of obedience, but of revelation. The archive was just as she'd left it, vast and ancient, a place the modern court had long forgotten. Shelves carved into the walls, filled with bone scrolls, cracked tablets, and leather-bound volumes bound in languages no longer spoken. But she moved past them. Her destination was not the shelves but the floor. In the center of the chamber, ringed by candle holders and old carvings, was a bare circle of stone. She'd sensed something beneath it the first time, a hum in her bones. Now she felt it more clearly. Like a heartbeat. She knelt and pressed her hand to the floor. Nothing. Then she placed her bare palm flat against the center of the circle, and felt it ignite. Her hand burned. Not with pain but recognition. Her skin lit with patterns of heat that traced down her wrist, across her forearm, veins glowing like fire beneath flesh. She gasped but did not pull away. A line appeared on the stone. Then another. Etchings unfurled like vines. The floor beneath her shifted, a low grinding sound, like stones stirring from centuries of sleep. The seal rose. A circular disk of black stone emerged from the floor, its surface covered in runes and symbols too ancient to name. In its center was a shallow impression, the exact size of her palm. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in the indentation. And the world around her vanished. Flames roared behind her eyes, blinding yet beautiful. She stood in a realm of fire and smoke, but untouched by heat. Before her rose a throne of obsidian, and upon it sat a woman wreathed in fire. Her crown was not metal but flickering flame. Her robes were ash and starlight. In her arms, the woman held a child swaddled in red cloth. She looked up and met Anaya's gaze, not with fear but with fierce joy. "You have returned," the queen said. The words were not heard through ears. They were felt in bone and blood, ancient and true. Anaya trembled. "Who are you?" "I am the first flame," the queen answered. "The fire they buried beneath stone. The line they tried to erase." She stood and stepped down from the throne. Around them echoes moved, warriors, scribes, mothers, all wreathed in gold and fire. "You are of my blood," the queen said. "Not through name but through truth. You carry the scar of what they feared most, the light before the sword." Anaya looked down. Her birthmark, a small flame-shaped mark on her hip she had always hidden, now glowed bright. "This was your seal," the queen continued. "It waited for you. As we did." "What am I meant to do?" Anaya whispered. The queen placed the child into her arms. The infant vanished, replaced by a glowing brand across Anaya's chest, a flame, encircled in rings of old language. "Remember who you are. And what they did to us." Then the world burst into flame and Anaya awoke, lying on the stone floor of the archive. She was alone. But changed. Her birthmark still glowed faintly. So did her veins where the seal's light had touched her. But more than that, she now knew her name. Not Anaya the servant. Not Anaya the orphan girl. Anaya of the first fire. She stood slowly, the stone seal still glowing beneath her. It had settled again into the floor, now bearing new carvings around its edges, symbols she somehow understood. The fire shall return through the forgotten child. Anaya placed her palm once more on the center. The glow dimmed but didn't vanish. It would wait for her now. Recognize her always. As she walked back through the corridor, her steps felt different. Not just purposeful but powerful. The stone no longer felt heavy beneath her feet. The silence no longer silenced her. And as she passed the great crest of the royal house, carved into the arch above the library's door, she reached out and pressed her blood-stained fingers against the sun-shaped insignia. It shimmered again. This time brighter. Behind her, a distant wind stirred. From the crypts, the dungeons, the long-forgotten chambers buried beneath the palace, something had awoken. Something that knew her name now. By morning she would be a servant again. But the seal beneath the stones knew better. So did she. The morning light filtering through the palace felt different. It struck the stones with a strange gleam, like the sun itself hesitated before touching the ancient walls. Anaya walked the hallways slowly, cautiously, with her hands tucked beneath her sleeves, covering the faint glowing sigils now etched into her shoulders and collarbone. No one else had seen them yet. She wasn't ready for that. The palace felt aware of her. She couldn't explain it. She had walked these corridors for years, unnoticed and unimportant. Now the air thickened as she passed. Her footsteps echoed where silence had once swallowed them. Even the shadows seemed to shift away from her, bending to light her path. When she reached a door, any door, the latch would sometimes lift with a quiet creak as though her arrival was expected. It began with the servant's wing. The heavy kitchen door that usually required a firm shove now swung open the moment she neared. The scullery maid blinked in surprise, muttering something about drafts. Then a hallway near the east tower, long sealed off for repairs, seemed to breathe open as she approached. Dust rose in lazy spirals. A mouse scurried across the threshold, then paused to look at her with curious black eyes before disappearing. Then came the whispers. They didn't come from people. They came from the walls. Late at night, as she returned from polishing floors or cleaning out hearths, she would hear murmurs, low, almost reverent sounds. Not voices exactly, but impressions, as though the palace's stones carried memories and were trying to share them. Sometimes she caught glimpses of movement in the old mirrors, not her reflection but a shadow walking beside her. Once, in the reflection of the silver basin in the queen's washroom, she saw a flicker of fire behind her shoulder. It was not frightening. It was familiar. More strange still were the memories. Not her own, and yet they bloomed behind her eyes as if they had always belonged there. She'd kneel to scrub the marble steps and suddenly know the names of the stonemasons who carved them. She'd brush her fingers along a banister and recall a queen once leaning there, waiting for her daughter to descend for her first dance. In the vast gallery of portraits, she stared up at a woman whose name had been lost for centuries, and knew her as Lyra of the Third Flame. A name she could never have learned. She dreamed of fire not as destruction but as language. Flames that danced in sigils, communicating in spirals and rhythm. She dreamed of a child held over a basin of light, herself perhaps, and a voice saying, "She carries the mark." The sigils on her shoulders pulsed brighter with each passing day. They were not mere decorations. They shifted. They moved. As though responding to the palace's own awakening. She would catch glimpses of them in polished surfaces, symbols reshaping, glowing faintly as if decoding a language only she could read. One evening she was delivering linens to the queen's chambers. The route passed by the old part of the palace, the west wing long closed off, draped in tapestries to discourage curiosity. Servants called it the bone wing, claiming it was haunted. But Anaya felt pulled. Her lantern flickered as she passed the corridor. The air thickened like holding breath. And then the tapestry, the one bearing the sigil of the first king, lifted without wind. Behind it was a golden door. She had never seen it before. No one had. Its surface was smooth as glass, adorned with carvings that shimmered faintly, the same fire-like patterns now etched into her shoulders. At its center blazed a symbol she now recognized, the first flame. She stepped closer. Her heart beat hard enough to drown out thought. She lifted a hand. The sigils on her skin responded, flaring. The moment her palm touched the door, it sighed open. Inside was darkness, deep and ancient. But she wasn't afraid. The sun chamber had waited centuries for her. The room beyond was circular and vast, its dome rising like the inside of a golden lantern. Every inch of the walls was carved, not with stories of battles or kings, but with spirals of light and names written in languages long forgotten. At the chamber center was a low pedestal, and atop it, a bowl of still-burning embers that gave off no smoke and no heat. They shimmered with soft light, pulsing gently as if breathing. When she stepped into the center of the chamber, the carvings ignited. A wave of light raced along the walls, lighting the sigils, casting their reflections in every direction. Her shoulders burned with matching warmth. It was not pain, it was completion. The palace no longer whispered. It sang. Her hands trembled. She knelt before the pedestal, unsure of what to do, but her body knew. Her fingers moved in patterns she hadn't learned. Her lips whispered a language she had never studied. By the line unbroken, by the fire unquenched, let truth wake and lies turn to ash. The embers flared. The dome trembled. Visions poured into her like molten gold, an unbroken lineage of flame-blooded queens and kings, healers and seers, warriors with voices like thunder. They had been erased, killed, buried, but not lost. And she, a servant, nameless, born of no known house, was the last spark. The palace had not forgotten. The stones, the sigils, the door, they had all remembered. They had waited, silently, for her blood to return. She stood slowly, light pouring from her palms. Outside the chamber, the halls were no longer asleep. Throughout the palace, lights flickered. Paintings shifted in their frames. The great bell in the tower, one that hadn't rung in a century, chimed once. In the throne room, the golden crest above the dais began to glow, unnoticed by the guards standing watch. And in the queen's private study, a sealed scroll unfurled on its own, revealing the words, "The first fire has risen." By the time Anaya left the chamber, dawn was bleeding into the sky. The world outside still slept, but the palace was alive. And it knew her now, not as a servant, but as the one it had been built to shelter. The palace was not the only thing waking. Anaya's presence, once unnoticed, now stirred more than stone and flame. Whispers moved through the corridors, passed between stable hands and kitchen girls, scribbled in chalk on servant walls and muttered behind veils. They called her many names, ghost princess, fireborn, flame child, though few knew her true story. Fewer still dared speak it aloud. But one did. Lady Morin was a quiet figure within the court, always present but rarely noticed. She dressed modestly, spoke seldom, and carried herself with the dignity of someone with nothing left to prove. Most believed her old, harmless, a relic of a forgotten noble line. But behind her stillness lived fire, slow burning, enduring. It was Lady Morin who found Anaya just after her return from the sun chamber. She said nothing at first. Simply left a folded piece of parchment beneath Anaya's linen bundle in the laundry. The fire does not hide. Midnight. East wing. Anaya almost ignored it. But her feet carried her anyway. The east wing was colder than the rest of the palace. Midnight found her waiting outside a narrow door she hadn't noticed before, until it opened silently. Lady Morin stood within, lit by the glow of a single wall lantern. She looked directly into Anaya's eyes, not with doubt or fear but with recognition. "I've been waiting a long time to meet you," she said. She led Anaya inside without further explanation. The chamber was small but filled with ancient artifacts, a sword with flame-carved etching, books older than any library she'd seen, a broken crown of black and gold. "You're not the first to awaken the seal," Morin said. "But you are the first it has accepted fully in many generations." Anaya said nothing. Her pulse trembled in her wrist. Lady Morin studied her, then added, "The sun line was never truly gone. It was scattered, hidden, buried like seeds in ash. I was born to protect those seeds, to teach the one who might come. And now here you are." She began Anaya's training that same night. There were no ceremonies, no declarations, only practice, and endless correction. You stand like a servant. A queen balances from her spine. You move with fear. A ruler walks like the earth owes them silence. You speak too softly. Even a whisper must sound like a command. Each night, after duties ended, Anaya returned to the room. Lady Morin trained her in secret. The language of old courts, gestures that demanded loyalty, ways to read rooms without seeming to look. She learned how to hold a goblet so it signaled peace, or war. How to lift her chin with just enough defiance to make lords falter. How to balance a crown's invisible weight without ever wearing one. But Lady Morin taught more than poise. She told Anaya stories, of her ancestors, the queens of fire and song, of sunblood rulers who chose justice over conquest, and how they were betrayed by fearmongers who renamed history to hide truth. "They feared you would return one day," she whispered. And they were right. Each night the lessons deepened. Each day Anaya moved through the palace differently. She no longer bowed quite as low. Her gaze no longer fell to the floor. The servants noticed first. They began making space for her when she passed. Then the stewards. Then the guards. And with recognition came danger. Prince Kale, long basking in the ease of unchallenged rule, began to feel the tremor in his throne. It began with rumors, a servant girl with royal posture, a nobody who had the favor of ghosts. Then came the reports of sealed doors opening, old symbols glowing, of a voice heard in the library speaking in the tongue of the founders. He laughed at first, called it superstition. But when an ancient portrait cracked in the hall, the one painted over the image of the last Sun Queen, and the original face bled through the paint to resemble Anaya, he grew silent. Kale summoned his spies. He ordered interrogations among the lower servants, had their quarters searched. But the network that now protected Anaya was built on silence, loyalty, and old truth. No one gave her away. Because she didn't act like one of them pretending to be royal. She acted like someone who had always been royal and was only now remembering it. Still, Kale was not blind. He saw the shifting glances, the hesitation in the council chamber, the way nobles began referencing founding law, a code older than his line. The threat was real. He began to whisper of purging the palace. Cleaning rot from the roots. War brood. Not open, not yet, but waiting in narrowed eyes and sharpened smiles. Lady Morin knew time was short. She pressed Anaya harder. "You must be ready. Not to wear a crown. To challenge one." "But what if they don't believe me?" Anaya asked once. Morin smiled, small and tired. "Belief is a wind. It changes. But truth is stone. You don't need them to believe it. You only need to stand on it long enough for them to feel the weight." The next night she gave Anaya a gift, wrapped in flame-colored silk. Inside was a mask. It was carved of old sunwood, light as breath, painted in gold and deep red. Symbols ringed the brow, the same that danced on Anaya's shoulders. "This is not to hide you," Morin said. "It's to remind them what they forgot. The sun line ruled with face and flame. When you wear this, you are not asking. You are claiming. Anaya took it, hands trembling. Outside, Kale's men whispered of a traitor rising from the kitchens. Inside, the fire prepared to step into the light. The coronation feast was declared in a blaze of banners and bells, announced with flourishes that masked the dread behind the gold. Prince Kale, newly emboldened by unrest, summoned nobles from every corner of the realm to witness his final step toward absolute rule. He said it was tradition. He said it was destiny. But for those who listened closely, the word carried a different tone now, one filled with desperation. Whispers of the sun line had spread beyond the palace. Nobles once content in their distance had begun to question. Some quietly returned to their ancient scrolls. Others studied their heirlooms for the symbols of fire. And among the common folk, songs were being sung again. Lullabies about a flame that could not be drowned, a queen who would rise from ash. Kale knew he had to act. The coronation would not just crown him. It would smoke out the ghost that haunted his halls. Lady Morin tried to stop Anaya from attending. It's too dangerous. He expects you, she said, voice low and tight as she adjusted Anaya's collar. He's laid a trap and you're walking into it. Anaya, seated beside the fireplace, ran her fingers along the edges of the sunwood mask. He's afraid. That's why he's rushing. That fear is louder than anything I could say. Fear turns men cruel, Morin warned. He'll not simply exile you. Not now. He'll want a spectacle. Proof to the realm that blood doesn't matter. That fire can be snuffed. Anaya lifted her eyes. Then let him light the pyre. I won't burn. The plan was simple. Enter the sun chamber once more. During the feast, when guards were drunk and Kale was distracted, Lady Morin and 2 loyal stewards would guide Anaya through the servant passages to the west wing. There, she would take her place before the chamber's throne and declare herself. But Kale was not distracted. He was waiting. As Anaya slipped through the corridor near the tapestry, a hand clamped down on her wrist. Iron cold. A dozen guards emerged from the darkness, not drunk, not dazed, but silent and deadly. Lady Morin was nowhere in sight. Kale stepped forward, cloaked in black and silver. So predictable, he said. All these games. All these stories. But you forget, this is my palace. And I know every stone. Anaya stared at him, unflinching. The palace does not belong to you. He smiled. And yet here I am. And there you kneel. They bound her hands. They tore away the mask. Her sigils glowed, but they laughed, calling them tricks of dye and lamp oil. They dragged her through the feast hall, nobles gasping, servants whispering, and threw her into the stone belly of the dungeons below. There the walls swallowed her whole. The cell was damp, lit only by a single flickering torch beyond the bars. Chains hung from the walls. Water dripped from the ceiling in slow, rhythmic drops that echoed like heartbeats. Alone, Anaya sat. The silence was not empty. The stones remembered. They spoke in vibrations, not words but pulses that pressed against her bones. She pressed her palms to the wall, closed her eyes and listened. A hum. A pulse. A rhythm. Follow. It began with warmth under her fingertips. Then a small seam revealed itself in the floor, a gap between bricks that had not been visible before. She dug, hands raw and trembling, until the floor beneath gave way. A staircase, narrow and ancient, spiraled downward beneath the dungeon. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old smoke. She descended. Each step whispered memories, fragments of old voices, chants of fire rites, lullabies sung beneath breath. At the bottom, a chamber opened before her, unlike any she had ever seen. It was circular, carved entirely from black stone, and at its center stood a pedestal wrapped in vines made of iron. Upon it rested a crown, not of gold or silver but of flame. Not metaphorical flame. Real flame. It burned, silent and unmoving, shaped like a circlet of dancing tongues, floating just inches above the stone. She stepped forward. The fire did not resist. It bent toward her. As she reached for it, the sigils on her skin blazed with light, brighter than they had ever glowed. Her shoulders pulsed with heat, her eyes filled with tears. She was not afraid. Her fingers closed around the fire. And it did not burn her. It settled. The crown, once untouchable, shaped itself to her head, warm, weightless, humming with memory. Visions exploded behind her eyes, of her ancestors, of the Sun Queens and their silent war, of betrayals inked in royal signatures and truths buried beneath silver lies. When she opened her eyes, the chamber lit with dancing light. The stairwell behind her had sealed. But she no longer needed escape. The palace would open to her. The stones would rise for her, and fire would follow. The morning sun rose pale and weak, as if the sky itself hesitated to witness what was to come. Word had spread quickly. The girl with the glowing marks, the servant who dared claim the old blood, was to be executed at high noon. No charges were spoken aloud. No trial was given. It was to be a cleansing, Kale claimed. A final severing of rumor from crown. The throne room had been cleared of its tapestries. Guards stood at every door. Nobles filled the chamber, some grim, some curious, some simply hungry to watch something burn. A pyre of polished wood had been arranged in the center of the marble floor, ringed with salt. Prince Kale stood before it in his ceremonial armor, dark and gleaming, the sun crest heavy on his chest. His sword, rumored to be forged from star iron, hung at his side. But Anaya did not appear. Not through the gates. Not in chains. Not flanked by guards. Instead, the floor beneath the pyre began to rumble. At first it was subtle, a tremor mistaken for nerves. Then came the cracking of stone. The nobles stepped back. Guards shouted. The polished marble split open with a groan that echoed like a great beast waking from centuries of slumber. From beneath the fractured earth, flame erupted, not wild but controlled, coiling like smoke shaped by breath. And then she rose. Anaya, cloaked in soot and firelight, crowned in flame, eyes calm and unblinking. The old crown blazed atop her head, not molten but glowing with a steady, living warmth. Her sigils pulsed in rhythm with the fire around her. The very stones that had once held her now lifted her. The nobles gasped. Some fled, stumbling over robes. Some knelt without knowing why. Kale did neither. He stepped forward, his face contorted with rage, his sword drawn. "Which," he spat. "This is trickery." Anaya said nothing. She simply walked across the cracked marble, and with each step, the torches along the walls flared, one by one, as if saluting her return. Kale roared and charged. His blade arced toward her, high, precise, fatal. But before it could reach her, it stopped. Not in her hand. In the air. The metal shimmered, then sagged, then drooped like wax before a candle. The blade melted down the hilt, dripping onto the floor with a hiss that filled the silent chamber. Kale stumbled backward, his hands burned, his eyes wide. You're nothing," he snarled. A servant girl pretending to be royalty. Anaya's voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried, echoed by stone, amplified by truth. "I am the flame you tried to bury. I am the crown your bloodline stole. The palace remembers me. The throne does not sing your name." And as she spoke, the palace responded. Walls groaned. Windows trembled. The golden crest behind the throne, the symbol of Kale's rule, cracked clean down the center, and from behind it an older symbol emerged, a sun encircled by flame. The true crest. The forgotten mark. The throne room trembled once more, not in fear but in recognition. Kale fell to his knees, hands trembling. "Please?" Anaya stepped closer. Fire curled at her feet but did not touch him. "I am not here to burn you," she said. "You will live. And every breath you take will be beneath the truth you tried to erase." He collapsed weeping. The guards did not move. The nobles remained silent. And high above, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks, casting a shaft of gold through the ruined roof, striking her crown, setting it aglow like a star reborn. The bloodline had been recognized. And the fire-blooded had risen. The palace had not known quiet in years. Its halls, once filled with the echoes of boots and the murmurs of wary courtiers, now carried the sound of open windows and birdsong. The air felt lighter. Doors that had remained locked for generations creaked open one by one. The throne room, though scarred by fire and cracked stone, pulsed with something new, not fear, not command. Presence. Anaya stood where Kale once stood, not to rule from a height, but to address those long made to bow. She summoned no guards, wore no armor. Only her crown, still glowing faintly with warm firelight, and a cloak sewn from servant cloth, mended, patched, real. Her first words were not a decree. They were a release. To those who cleaned chambers they would never sleep in. To those who served names they were never allowed to speak. "You are free." Murmurs swept through the great hall. Disbelief. Hope. She turned to the side doors and nodded. The gates were thrown wide and the servants, cooks, sweepers, scribes, messengers, were led in, blinking, hesitant. They looked to one another. Then to her. Then, slowly they stepped forward. Some wept. Others fell to their knees. She stopped them. "No more kneeling," she said gently. "Not here. Not to me." She moved through them, touching shoulders, lifting hats. Not a ruler descending but a root rising, Deep, old, buried, now blooming. The royal laws were next. Anaya entered the council chamber, where generations of power had been inscribed in ink no one was allowed to challenge, and stood before the great wall of edicts. With one hand aflame, she touched each decree binding bloodlines to land, to rule, to silence. The fire read the truth in the ink and burned away the lies. She opened the royal libraries, once sealed to all but nobles and scholars, now available to anyone who could read, or willing to learn. Scrolls whispered in ancient tongues were passed into the hands of farmers, of bakers, of children with wide eyes and ink-stained fingers. The kingdom began to breathe differently. Yet there was one place Anaya refused to return to, the throne itself. The seat of power, carved in obsidian and inlaid with sun gold, stood cracked from Kale's defeat. It had ruled through fear, its jagged arms reminders of war and betrayal. It was a symbol of a lineage that had tried to erase her. She did not want it. She melted it. Under the rising sun, in the palace courtyard, the throne was carried to the forge. Before the gathered crowd, Anaya placed her hand over its armrest. Fire, gentle and controlled, spilled from her palm. The obsidian groaned, then softened, then flowed. Gold ran like river light. She cast the new throne from stone pulled from the mountain caves, sun-kissed, pale, rough to the touch, warm even in shade. It bore no crown at its top. Only a wide, open seat and the symbol of the flame encircled by hands. When asked what it should be called, she said only, "The throne without chains." She sat not above the people but among them. Her rule was not loud. She spoke with few words and many actions. She walked the markets. She listened to farmers. She read with children in the library. She asked questions before she ever gave commands. And slowly the kingdom changed. In the streets, songs were no longer about victory and blood, but about quiet justice, about the girl who rose not to conquer but to heal. Some nobles left in protest. Others stayed watching, learning. A few even knelt, not to worship but to ask for forgiveness. Anaya always gave it. Because hers was not a throne built to punish the past. It was built to break its cycle. And as the sun set behind the hills and the last embers of her old life cooled into memory, Anaya, fire-blooded and free, sat not in silence but in peace, and never alone. Years passed and time, as it always does, softened the edges of history. But the story of the servant who became queen was never allowed to fade. It was not kept behind golden pages or hidden in scholars' towers. It lived instead in the mouths of children, in the voices of old women at evening fires, and in the simple carvings above doorways, a sun encircled by dancing flames. In every village, no matter how small, the tale was told. They spoke of Anaya, once a servant, once unseen, who melted a throne and cast a kingdom in truth. Children sat wide-eyed around storytellers, clutching flame-marked pendants carved from wood or stone. These little talismans were not mere decoration. They were tokens of courage, of memory, of what it meant to rise not through birthright but through burning away what was false. Schools took root where none had been before. In one-room huts and wide temple halls, boys and girls alike were taught not only letters and numbers, but the names of those history had tried to bury. Anaya was not a queen crowned in conquest, they were taught, but a mirror. She reflected what the kingdom had become, and what it could be. The throne without chains remained, still at the palace, still open to the sun. No ruler sat there for life, only for seasons. It had become tradition that each ruler stepped down after their time, that power never again be mistaken for permanence. Leaders were chosen for wisdom, not blood, and always before a new ruler took their seat, they knelt at the mouth of the old forge, where the melted throne had once pooled. The fire beneath the palace still burned. It was not a consuming fire but a living one, steady, deep, patient. Some called it sacred. Others simply called it the flame of memory. It had no name but was known by its presence. A warmth in the walls, a hush in the halls, a flicker in the stone. On cold nights, when the wind howled through the streets and doubt crept into people's minds, when justice faltered or pride returned, the fire would shift, flicker, grow hotter, as if remembering, as if warning. They said the flame was a promise, a reminder that the kingdom had once forgotten who built it, and suffered, and that if it forgot again, the fire would rise not to destroy, but to remind. At the edge of the palace gardens, beneath a flowering tree that bloomed all year long, a statue stood. Not of Anaya in royal robes or seated on a throne, but of her as she had been the day she first emerged from the ground, cloaked in soot and light, one hand raised, the other open. The inscription read, "She did not take the throne. She remade it." Pilgrims came from distant lands to touch that statue. Not to worship, but to remember what could be done when truth was stronger than steel. No one ever discovered where Anaya went after her years of rule. Some claim she walked into the hills and never returned. Others said she returned to the tunnels, that she sleeps beneath the stones still, her hand resting on the fire, ready to rise should the truth ever be buried again. And so, each year on the longest night, the anniversary of the day the old throne cracked, the people gather in silence. No songs, no speeches. Only candles placed along the streets and palace steps. They light them not in mourning but in thanks. In the dark, you can hear them whisper to their children, "Let fire be your memory. Let justice be your crown." And always, always, the flame never died.